This study essentially showed, I'll just read the conclusions, that an 8-hour time-restricted feeding produces a mild caloric restriction and weight loss without calorie counting. So that's key, right? These people aren't calorie counting. Somehow, just by adhering to an 8-hour window, they are taking in fewer calories than they're burning off. And clinically, it reduced blood pressure. And let's come up with the ideal intermittent fasting, aka time-restricted feeding schedule for you. And when I say ideal, I mean, what are the variables that are negotiable? What are the ones that are non-negotiable? What is ideal for you will depend on the context of your life and what you are willing to do consistently. So, first of all, we established, based on the discussion with Sachin, who is truly the premier world expert in this area, who knows the animal and human scientific literature better than anybody, has written this incredible review, and for whom I consulted, that you do not want to ingest food for at least, I want to emphasize, at least 60 minutes post waking up. Second, you want to avoid ingesting any food of any kind, even 1 gram of sugar. Remember, this is the ideal. 1 gram of sugar even would be too much, for the 2 to 3 hours prior to bedtime. He also mentioned, ideally, you are spending 8 hours in bed. I didn't tell you that earlier. I saved that for now. But ideally, you're sleeping that entire 8 hours. But simply by being in bed for that 8 hours and avoiding food after waking for an hour and before bed for 2 to 3 hours, you're starting to build out the duration of this fasted period. Remember that the sleep-related fasting is particularly important for the health benefits of time-restricted feeding. Again, the sleep-related fasting is especially important because of all the cellular repair processes that occur in the liver, in the gut, in the microbiome, in the brain, all over the body, and because of the way that that coordinates the expression of the clock genes that are then going to wick out and have many other positive effects on health, including weight and fat loss, but in addition to that, liver health, etc. An 8-hour feeding window as a target seems to be the best target feeding window, at least by my read of the literature and in discussing it with Sachin. Shorter feeding windows of 4 to 6 hours tend to lead to overeating and potentially increases in weight. 1 meal per day type eating do not seem to do that, but those are special cases in that most people can't adhere to a 1 meal per day type schedule, at least not on a regular basis, and it's not very compatible with most social schedules. Regular placement of the eating window or feeding window every 24 hours is important. You don't have to be absolutely rigid and neurotic about this, but you don't want it sliding around on the weekend so that it's starting 2 hours later and ending 2 hours later a couple days a week. Because then you start to offset many of the positive health effects that have been demonstrated for time-restricted feeding. Remember, if you eat your food within a certain feeding window, but that feeding window shifts by a couple hours, it is effectively like jet lagging your system. It is effectively like traveling a couple time zones over, eating there for a few days and coming back, when in fact, you're not traveling. And that's because of the way that food adjusts these circadian clock genes. Now, you can offset some of that through the use of light, and I've talked extensively about how to use light in previous podcasts, but again, early morning and all day bright light exposure as safely as you can, ideally from sunlight, not through a window, etc. Avoiding bright light in the middle of the night, extremely important for mood, offsetting metabolic dysfunction, etc. When should that 8-hour window be placed within each 24-hour cycle? Well, let's talk about ideal. Ideal, if you really want to maximize all the health benefits of time-restricted feeding, you need to extend the fast around sleep on both sides. You would place it smack dab in the middle of the day. It would be a schedule in which you started eating, for instance, at 10 a.m. and you stopped eating at 6 p.m. an absolutely dreadful schedule for anyone that wants to have some semblance of a normal life. In my opinion, it's not really compatible with most schedules, although some people might be able to do it. Maybe you and your family or your friends, you're eating a late breakfast and then you're having a late-ish lunch around 2 p.m. and then you have dinner at 6. And then assuming that you go to bed around 9:30 or 10 p.m., that is going to extract the maximum amount of weight-related, body fat-related, metabolic factor-related aspects of time-restricted feeding. Some people tend to fall into a category where they do best placing that feeding window later in the day, and provided it doesn't run too close to your sleep. Remember, you need a 2 or 3 hour buffer before your sleep where you're not ingesting anything. That's in order to extract the benefits of time-restricted feeding. Well, then starting your feeding window at 12 p.m. and ending it at 8 p.m., plus or minus half an hour or so, day to day, seems like a perfectly reasonable schedule. For some people, starting at 2 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m. will be that schedule. Of course, you have to take into consideration when you exercise, if you exercise. For instance, I like to exercise early in the day. If I run or if I do some moderate or light intensity exercise, regardless of what type of exercise it is, I have no trouble waiting until my feeding window kicks in around noon or even 2 p.m. But if I do high intensity weight training, for instance, early in the day, or if I run sprints and I do that at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., by 11 a.m., I am very, very hungry and it's hard for me to do other things, concentrate, etc. Now, I'm not neurotic about my feeding window. As I mentioned before, I kind of let it expand and contract a bit around the 8-hour mark and feel perfectly free to do that too. We're talking here in ideals, not in necessarily practicals. But other people find that they're very hungry when they wake up early in the day. If you're one of these people, or you're somebody who really is trying to emphasize hypertrophy or maintenance of muscle, then it does seem that ingesting protein early in the day is beneficial, that it can be more readily converted into muscle tissue. And this has been demonstrated in at least one study. There's another study underway that's exploring this further. For people that are really, really interested in hypertrophy and building muscle, well then time-restricted feeding is usually not the way they go. But there are, of course, people that are trying to gain weight or who don't want to lose weight or who are trying to maximize physical performance or hypertrophy or things of that sort. And so, of course, time-restricted feeding for them might be, as long as I'm awake, I'm eating. And I tip my hat to those people and just say, provided you understand what you're doing and the burden that places on some of the other processes in your body, if that's right for you, then by all means pursue that. And then, of course, we discussed how making sure that you're ingesting enough fluids, in particular water and salt, especially if you're using caffeine in order to increase your levels of alertness, regardless of where that caffeine source comes from, coffee, tea, or otherwise. That can cause the excretion of sodium and can lead to a kind of shakiness, a lightheadedness, and the feelings of hunger that may or may not be related to blood glucose. Some people genuinely need to eat. I certainly would not want to see people getting hypoglycemic to the point where it's dangerous. Certainly if you are diabetic, and in fact for all people, you should consult with your physician when exploring any major changes to diet or additions or subtractions of anything, including supplementation. But for most people, maintaining relatively low to modest blood glucose levels is going to be pretty healthy and will allow all the positive effects of intermittent fasting to occur. And when you find that reaching that start to the feeding window is challenging, that ingesting sodium can often stabilize your system mentally and physically and allow you to reach that window, often painlessly.